Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Kate and I'm the programming director here at Hamilton Artisting. And so I'm just going to introduce this panel discussion on There and Here, Identities and Diaspora in the Contemporary Moment. I'm going to introduce the moderator Bahar, who is a medical student at McMaster University. She holds an MA in comparative literature, and her research in graduate school took up medical humanities, feminist theory, and the art of Frida Kahlo. She is passionate about women's health, narrative medicine, and reproductive justice. She is currently in the throes of organizing a medical humanities conference, and she shares art and writing on her blog. So, here you go.
Thank you so much. So, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm very excited to be here today with this wonderful panel of artists and writers, where we'll just be talking a bit more about the exhibition. So before we get started with some discussion, I guess we'll just do some introductions. So just immediately on my left, we have Abedar Kamgari, who is an emerging artist and the curator of There and Here. Her studio practice focuses on an exploration of personal identity by means of an investigation of immigrant experience. The perception and representation of women of color within Canadian society are ongoing areas of research fueling her practice. Abedar currently lives and works in Hamilton and has shown her art in Canada and the United States. So we just want to talk a bit to your practice.
Thank you. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my motivation behind wanting to curate this exhibition. This has been something this exhibition has kind of been on my mind for the last several months. I've been thinking about it since the summer. So it's been really nice to see it finally come together. But really, the reason behind wanting to curate this exhibition was seeing a number of local exhibitions dealing with similar issues and kind of seeing a lack in a certain type of representation that I was interested in. So, for example, I saw several exhibitions on Canadian national identity. These were group exhibitions, really well put together, and I was really happy to see that these exhibitions included work by Indigenous artists, but there was a complete lack of Canadian artists of color in this dialogue about Canadian national identity. And that was something that was quite disheartening as a Canadian of color working in this country, seeing that the work of my contemporaries was not being represented in exhibitions about what Canada is, because I feel like the diversity in Canada is such a great part of it. And on the other hand, there was also a lot of exhibitions I was seeing of work by immigrant artists, and these exhibitions were really interesting and really great to see, but for me what was lacking was the younger generation of immigrants making art. So, for example, there was an exhibition organized by SAVAC, which is the South Asian Visual Arts Center in Toronto, and they organized an exhibition at the Robert McMaster Gallery in Oshawa. I think it was around September, and the exhibition was called Domesticating Distance. And it was a really interesting exhibition, bringing together some really interesting, well-established and mid-career artists. And these were all artists who had immigrated to the West as adults. And for me, I felt that my experience as an immigrant, as someone trying to figure out what my identity was in this new country, it was quite a different experience than artists who had come to Canada at an older age. So I wasn't really seeing the younger generation, or my generation, really represented in these exhibitions. And there was also this sense of separation that Canadians whose practices was about identity and culture were somehow grouped together in shows based on where they were from, and not really shown within spaces talking about Canadian identity as a whole, even though they are living in Canada and are very much Canadians. So these two things were really what prompted me to want to take on this project and bring together 3 artists who are first and second generation Canadians. 2 of the artists in this exhibition have been born in Canada, so their experience in the diaspora is quite different than a lot of the other artists whose practices have been shown locally. So that was really my interest in wanting to put these artists together, and I've been really lucky to work with all 3 of them. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Abedar. And next we have Nedda. She was born in Hamilton in 1993 and is currently pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Visual Art at York University. Inspired by the tensions between subject and authority, her work is reflective of personal narratives and how they subvert the perceived objectivities of dominant discourses in education, religion, war, and the media. Her practice vacillates between staged studio pieces, found materials, and interactive installations.
Thanks, Bahar. So I've explored the conditions of an Assyrian identity in diaspora, paying close attention to cultural preservation and assimilation. So one of the things I'm inspired by is the strong desire in migrants to preserve their customs and traditions outside of the homeland, and the fear that one's cultural identity will be lost to the new and more dominant culture. So present in my work are observations of archival practices that my family has knowingly or unknowingly employed, ranging from common habits such as keeping family photographs to more obscure practices like freezing a pack of cigarettes for 14 years because it was the last thing that you grabbed from your last visit to your country of birth. And by contrast, having grown up in a traditionally Middle Eastern home within the larger Canadian society, I have felt that this anxiety surrounding cultural preservation is largely absent from the West, and I personally have a multifaceted perspective on the topic that's informed by both of these totally different subjectivities. So what I try to do in my practice is sort of hybridize or harmonize these two seemingly contrasting views. And though I work with different media, I have a strong interest in photo-based work because of the medium's strong connection with conservation and archival practices, as well as the actual photographic act and its attempt to sort of like freeze a moment that's already lost once it's captured. So I see photography as something that can simultaneously be sentimental and provocative at the same time, and for me this mirrors on my own duality with these issues surrounding identity and narrative.
Okay, thanks, Nedda. And at the end here we have Barbora Racevičiūtė.
Yeah, you're good enough.
Oh God, okay, I'm sorry.
That's all
okay. So she's a curator and art writer based in Vilnius, Montreal, and Toronto. She's currently completing her MFA in criticism and curatorial practice at Curated University. Her thesis work focuses on contemporary immigrant art in Canada in relation to how subject identities are conceived in nation-states today. Her recent writing centers on post-internet art as understood through the lens of object-oriented philosophy and the political imperatives and strategies of contemporary curatorial practice.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for coming here and being here with us. I guess I will talk about very briefly about my thesis, because that's how Abedar and I know each other, and that's how I came to be part of this amazing panel discussion. So my MFA thesis is an exhibition and written work, and it started out as an investigation of the relationships that immigrants have with their homelands and their host countries. And I was very interested in the duality that immigrants have within them, within their identity. And so that's the kind of major narrative of the diaspora. And the theory behind this, of this constant duality and the constant tensions between being here and being somewhere else, is very much talked about in literature, but not theorized and not really thought about in these terms that much in visual practice. And so that's how I came to conceive of the show of immigrant artists, and more specifically women immigrant artists, because I was interested in kind of locating the particularities of female perspectives. And when I was actually putting the show together, and when I was actually thinking about what was going on in Canada and what was necessary to say, I realized that this kind of poetic, abstract notion of being in two places, while important, wasn't politicized enough considering the kind of political imperatives that living in Canada has. And it kind of turned more into, the project as a whole turned more into a kind of question around how do we hold multiple perspectives and multiple selves within us, and I speak of us because I'm also an immigrant person, while living in a Canada that, while celebrating multiculturalism in abstract, really does ask of us to all be homogenous and all privilege or similarities rather than our differences. And so, yeah, and I realized that the artists that I was showing really did do this, and even more so that it wasn't just a reflection of what was going on within them and within our culture, but a really critical commentary on the ways of resisting and being individuals. And so, yeah, I think that's that.
Alright, okay. Well, thank you all for giving us a little bit more insight into your work. And we'll just move on to some discussion, and just to get the conversation going, we have some questions prepared for the panel. And the first question that we have is that recently there have been quite a few projects similar to There and Here in Southern Ontario. How do you see the seemingly recent desire to represent or self-represent immigrant Canadian art practices, especially in the context of emergent practices? We don't have to go in order, so anybody who wants to speak.
Yeah, I think that this is a question that I addressed in the curatorial essay, which is forthcoming, and this is something that I noticed. It was a funny moment because I put on this show, and this idea of showing immigrant work comes from the deep recesses of my undergrad and of reading literature about South Asian people who share very similar poetic experiences as I do. And then, I worked on this for 2 years, and at the moment I put on the show, there were 3 other exhibitions of emerging artists in Toronto doing the same thing. And as you're trying to kind of establish yourself, there's a moment in which you go, shit, this is not good, everybody's caught on to the idea. But at the same time, it was a brilliant moment, and I talked about this a lot because it meant that something was going on. And I think what's going on is that the kind of more established practices that Abedar referred to, they're not addressing the issues as they kind of work anymore. I think that there's increased connectivity in the world and an increased political climate and our awareness of the global political climate that doesn't allow us to kind of address issues in singular ways anymore. And there's an interdisciplinarity that happens. I don't know if my co-panelists will agree. But no, please, do disagree. And yeah, and so that's where my desire came from, for sure.
Oh, do you want to go? Well, no. Go.
I don't necessarily disagree. I think for me, I'm thinking about it from a different perspective almost. I mean, I think artists like Shirin Nishat or Jimmy, butcher her name, they've been working with these ideas for several decades, and I feel like there is a lot more culturally influenced imagery in their work. I mean, looking at Iranian Canadian or Iranian artists who are immigrants and living in the West, when I look at the practices of these artists as, especially those who come to the West as adults, I see a lot of ornamentation and I see a lot of text and use of poetry as, as stylistic patterns that seem to be apparent in a lot of their practices. And with the younger generation of immigrant Iranians who are working in the arts, I don't see this sense of stylization. For example, with my work, I think the sensibilities, at least aesthetically, are very much Western, or they're very much inspired by the aesthetics of other artists working in Canada, but not so much by Iran's cultural history or stylized by Islamic art as much as I see their practices. So I think the experience is quite different. I think for those artists, although their practices are very, very important for someone like me to look at, I think their question of identity is not quite the same as mine. I think with them, they're not really questioning whether or not they're Iranian. They know that they're Iranian. But for someone like me who came to Canada at a young age, there's always this question of, am I Iranian? Am I Canadian? And I'm sort of in this in-between space where I don't really know for sure. I can't really fully fit in here, but if I go back there, my first language is no longer fluent, even though I have the connection in terms of my heritage to that place. So I think the issues that we are dealing with is quite different, and this is why I'm continuing to talking about first and second generation Canadians, because I think even second generation Canadians who were born in Canada are still dealing with the issues in much of a similar way as I am, or maybe you are. But I don't know if you guys would agree with me. This is just my take on it.
I think you mentioned a couple things that sort of relate to one of the other questions that we're going to get to later on. So like, there's so much going on in my head, but I'm not going to get too deep into the last bit about belonging or not belonging to there or here. No pun intended. But I think speaking on what you said, Barbora, in terms of why these emerging practices are suddenly popping up and it's become the new sort of thing in the past couple of years. I can't say I really know for sure what it is, but I do feel that for me, what sort of prompted me to maybe start speaking about it in my work could have been the rise of social justice and social media, giving people of color as a whole more voices to share their stories and experiences, and that we're sort of valuing marginalized voices more and more. And as a result, I think that contemporary emerging artists are also expressing themselves in a similar fashion. So we're starting to sort of really increasingly value this intersectionality and deeply understand it. So.
We have so many other questions.
Yeah, okay. So in what ways do you think the work of younger artists exploring identity, culture, and ethnicity differs from the pivotal practices of older artists like Shirin Neshat or Jin Mi-yoon, as Abedar brought up, who have been engaging with similar themes for several decades?
Do you want me to go first again?
Yes, please. I already talked about this somewhere.
This kind of gives me an opportunity to disagree with Abedar about the idea that the older generation of artists that their experience differs. I had a really lovely moment in doing my MA research when I was talking to a Korean Canadian artist whose name is Jun Pak, and she immigrated to Canada as an adult. And she was talking to me about the specificity of her experience, how she goes back to Korea and she doesn't fit quite, but she kind of belongs there, but kind of not here, and then she comes back here. And she's like, you know, like that's really specific to my generation and like my perspective. And I was like, no, I feel the exact same way, and I'm from a completely different part of the world, and I'm 20 years younger. But I do think that the experience that they're looking at is very much in terms of back there in that culture and here in this culture. And I think, as Nedda brought up, there are many more intersectional concerns in your practices about gender, about roles of women, about class, about, you know, contexts that differ from these kind of very culturally, like, what culture do I identify with?
Either, Nikki? Okay.
She's just gonna disagree with me all over again.
Yeah. I'm just agree and add stuff.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of similar to how I feel, but I'd also like to add, like, Shirin Neshat described herself as an Iranian artist in exile, and Jin Mi-yoon, I'm so sorry if I'm saying her name wrong, tries to work with the idea of displacement. And I just don't think we see that really in contemporary emerging art practices, this feeling of displacement and exile, at least. Maybe I'm projecting because I personally don't, because I think the question is less about belonging and more about how we grapple with transnationalism or transcultural identity, however you want to define it, as well as assimilation. And I feel like we're trying to reconcile with these various facets of our identities rather than focusing on these like really sort of stark differences and contrasts. And that's another thing that Racevičiūtė talks about a lot in her practice, is like this really, really stark duality. Like it's like these two different things and they don't really merge, I guess, for her.
I'll try to say something. I think it's really tough to try to encapsulate these really complex artist practices into, you know, I feel a little bit guilty about trying to say, oh, you know, Shirin Neshat's practice is just this, or Jun Park's practice is just, you know, this. It's really complex, and I think there are definitely a lot of aspects of their practice that I do identify with, and the experience feels very unified. Like I feel the same way, and then there's other aspects that I don't, you know, I don't feel like it's me at all. But I think, at least for me, in my practice, the duality is always very much apparent. Like, at least as a way of thinking about and approaching my work. And it's not really, I mean, the work itself is not really about duality, but the duality is always there because I can't really stop comparing this place and that place, and my experience here and my experience there. So I guess in some ways maybe we are moving away from that duality, but I mean, I personally, at least, I'm not really done with trying to talk about displacement or even exile to some extent. I think maybe part of the practice, at least I'm going to talk just about my work, but I think it's a lot of times it's about the changes that immigrants go through as they move to a new country, and the ways in which we connect or alienate ourselves within this new culture. So whether or not we are really assimilating, I don't know. I don't think it's really ever truly possible, as hard as we may try. And I'm really interested in the ways in which we attempt to assimilate, or the rituals we adopt, or the actions we, or you know, the clothes or whatever we take on to try to feel a lot more as part of this culture. And that might have been a bit of a tangent, but I don't know if you guys have something.
Yeah, because you said, that I really like, I was trying to wrap my head around the fact that, you know, that you're privileging transcultural experience or the in-betweenness rather than the polarity, and I was like, what? And I do get that, and I think that there's something definitely to be said about the fact that contemporary artists, or emerging contemporary artists, are working in a positive sense with this duality rather than the kind of uncomfortable tension. They're trying to work towards a resolution, or not even towards a resolution, but towards like a positive embrace of like, those are the facts. But to kind of echo what Abedar is saying, I don't think we can get too much away from questions of exile and belonging, because no matter how much we privilege this idea of transculturalism and multiculturalism and global movement, there are very physical, material bodies who are in exile every day. In our culture, in our country, in our cities, and you know, and then even for the people who are not in exile, there are people who do not belong and were excluded from being able to belong. And so I think there's always the push and pull between the two.
Sorry. I think also something that I've been noticing a lot of artists talking about recently is this idea of hybrid identity, and this thing that's very in constant transformation. And I feel like a lot of, at least younger artists that I've been talking to, don't really like to say, you know, they are not really interested in defining their identity as a constant thing. And I think, at least from my observation of older artists, and older Iranian artists whose cultural background I'm a bit more familiar with, I think they, in many ways, they interact with the idea of, for example, the idea of women in Iran. So an artist like Haristu Foruhar, who makes, you know, very much works with the veil and is very much in dialogue with Shirin Neshat. Her work is really dealing with how women are perceived within Iran, and Iranian women are perceived in the West as this very much isolated and banished kind of figure in society. But I think with the younger generation of artists, it's not. I'm not really concerned with what the idea of or what is going on with Iranian women within Iran. I'm much more interested in how Iranian women are behaving as immigrants in Canada, because I'm much more interested in this interaction with Canada than I am with Iran, if that makes sense.
I think that, sorry, I didn't really mean to make it sound like we're sort of done with the question of exile and belonging and displacement. I think, sort of touching a little bit on what I said earlier, it is that we're like increasingly sort of focusing on intersectionality, but it certainly does derive from that, and I think that that's totally a fundamental question, and I think that that's where I need to sort of try to wrap up the answer to the question. That's where I mean, older artists were focusing just on that, and then we're sort of realizing, well, there's that, but then there's all these other things happening as well that we're exploring in all of our practices currently as emerging artists. So.
Okay, so I'm really interested in how you've all kind of been talking about how you're constantly in a process of negotiating, reconciling, while also frequently rejecting both there and here. How you're both there and here, but also neither there nor here. So I'm wondering, how do each of you, given your, divergent identities, how do you truly conceptualize belonging?
That's been a super difficult question for me for a long time, and I've essentially just decided that I don't need to answer it because I can't. Growing up, I very much felt like I wasn't Canadian, but I also felt like I wasn't Middle Eastern really at the same time, and to be neither is just, you can't be both. I felt like I couldn't be both, and I also couldn't be neither. So I just decided that belonging wasn't really important to me, and rather I started to just focus on the nuances between these two things.
Yeah. It's funny. I've never really, at a personal level, I think I've thought about it for sure. I think it happens at the micro level. In community settings and in familiar settings, but from a I'm Eastern European and I'm someone who's very loud and I embrace that, but I also get very marginalized for it, and I always have. It's that kind of stereotypical me. But I realized that having that perspective about myself was a strong point. That allowed me further criticality, and so while it always meant that I didn't belong a little bit, that it was always a little bit off, it provided me an edge, and so kind of transforming that into an empowering thing was where I felt that I could not belong, but at least be with myself all right.
Yeah, I think I very much agree with Nedda. I think it's not something that I can really ever answer, but it is a question that I'm interested in asking, especially through my work, my studio work, not my curatorial work. Also both. They're very much linked. But a couple weeks ago, I was in Jackson Square, and I was just looking for something at a dollar store, and this guy came up to me, and he said hi to me in Arabic, and then proceeded to ask me in English if I would donate to his charity or whatever he was raising money for. And I said, I don't speak Arabic. And he said, oh, what do you speak? And I said, I speak fluent English. And I was, it's kind of like probably me being very skeptical and almost waiting to snap at people about them noticing that I'm a visible minority. But I think it was interesting because the guy himself was also not, he was also a bit, sometimes we, without knowing it, we're kind of perpetuating ourselves into this cycle of being stuck as the other. And I don't think it's as simple as that. I think it's definitely something that's very political and complex, and there's a lot of social and cultural factors that tie into it. But I think in terms of belonging, I don't know how I could, present myself as a person who is not just Canadian, but also Iranian, but as someone who very much belongs in Canada and is not other. So I guess I can't really answer the question, but that was a fun analogy.
Can I ask you a follow-up on that?
Yeah, go for it.
It's funny because you term it in a skeptical way, for sure, but wouldn't you think that perhaps, but for the person, it wasn't like a further othering, but it was exactly of that point of possible belonging?
That's a really interesting point, and I guess in my bitter skepticism, I never thought about it that way. But yeah, I think it definitely is, and I think maybe I don't know. I think it's so complicated. A lot of times I hear my parents' generation talk about, especially in Iran, this idea the West was so held to such a high standard that people a lot of times attempt to behave Western, even within Iran. So I'm interested in how, I guess, us as immigrant people value this Western culture more than we might value our own culture. And sometimes, I don't think this is true in all cases, but it was definitely true in the case of my family, where they thought that this Western culture could do no wrong. And of course, there's flaws with every culture. So I think a part of that, with that came this almost kind of banishing our own culture the minute we stepped into Canada as a means of saying, I'm so modern and I'm so open-minded. Maybe part of that was not really wanting to identify with our own culture either. So that doesn't really answer your question directly.
No, but I think I think your answer is self-conscious about your own maybe perpetuation of wanting to be this Canadian through language, and I think that's something you also address in your work.
I just wanted to add that I think it's interesting you brought that up, because we often get asked the question, where are you from, as visible minorities? And it's kind of ridiculous because I'm actually not from anywhere other than Canada, being born here. But when people of color ask me, I understand that that's what it is. What you mentioned is trying to see if you're also kind of from a different place as they are, and that I'm othered in the same way that they are. So it's different, and I tend to forgive them when they ask me. And then otherwise, I do get the skepticism that you mentioned when someone else asks me where are you from, because I look different, or I look non-white, so.
Thank you. It kind of sounds like you might feel where you belong, where you can ask questions about belonging, which is really beautiful. So I guess at this point, we can open up questions. If there are any from the audience, we can take them for the panel. Yeah.
And I think this applies mostly to artistic practice, but perhaps it also applies to your curatorial practices. I'm thinking about your notions of hybridity and your transcultural aesthetics and your kind of balancing act. And I'm wondering if you ever panic when you feel yourself drifting too far to one side, or what you might think is too far to one side, or if you ever have that feeling. It's open to anyone.
Do you want to go first, or should I?
Thank you for the question. I'd say maybe before, I think it was 3 years ago when I sort of started actually getting into work exploring transculturalism, or whatever we want to call it. And before that, I was definitely kind of concerned that my work was looking very whitewashed, for lack of a better term. And I felt like I wasn't addressing things that were deeply important to me. And that's when I really felt like I was drifting way too far into one side. So I'd say I haven't felt like I'm drifting into the other one, whatever the other side really is, but yeah, I was concerned that I wasn't addressing the fact that I am a person of color and a marginalized person. So yeah, I've had those moments before. Abedar, I don't know about you.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think sometimes, especially now that there are so many persons of color in the emerging field dealing with these issues of identity and culture, I think for a lot of artists who are persons of color or from an immigrant background, I feel like they might feel guilty not making art about these issues, even though they're fully entitled to make art about whatever they want. I mean, I think there's a double standard where we had a student in one of our critiques make art about her own experience and her own cultural background, and people were talking about her work as if her work was this huge thing talking about the experience of the entire culture, and as if she was some sort of expert. But on the other hand, if a Canadian artist who was white put out work that was similarly engaging with their own identity and their own culture, nobody really treated their work as if that work was a stand-in for that whole culture. It was very much like, oh, this is your personal experience. But I found out when it was a person of color, it was like, oh, this is the experience of your people, even though the experiences are very much singular. But I think, yeah, in that sense, I don't know if I freak out more. I think more so when I see myself drifting to one direction or going on a slight hiatus from this sort of practice and I make something experimental. Sometimes I think, oh shoot, is it over? Am I done with these ideas? Am I gonna have a writer's block with these things that I've been milking for a couple years? But I don't know. I think there's so many things to do. So I don't really find myself going in either direction very often. I think I've been pretty consistently right in the middle.
Are there any other questions for our panel? Well, we do have one last question that we've prepared that we can ask. Yeah. Okay. So, we're in a moment of great international migration, and this, in combination with the conflict in the Middle East, are critically inflecting the political and cultural climate in which you are all working. Could you speak about this?
Would you want to? And I think this kind of pertains to the question that you asked, because for me the question read as, on the one hand, there's politically inflected work and politically critical work, and then the other hand, there's work that deals with other things, but that work, when it's not directly politically inflected, it can always be a little not inflected at all. And when it doesn't have a political grounding, for me, work ends up participating in capitalism and just consumer culture. And so those are the kind of two polarities that I work with in my curatorial practice and my writing practice, and I write about work all the time. And it's when I write about work that doesn't have a political backing, when I talk about form, I'm always a little bit afraid that I will, lack the necessary criticality. And this applies to the current global moment. And I am a white woman and a white curator and a white writer, and I think I think this works a lot with what Abedar was talking of needing. I think this is an opportunity for us to realize that we need to stop relying on people of color to explain to us what that experience is like and what being anti-racist is. And I think that's how this current moment has influenced kind of the courage that I've had to be direct in addressing these topics. And that's something that we've spoken at my university about in the last couple of days with OCAD's unfortunate ad campaign, which had a really lovely message of inclusivity that turned into a racist campaign, to be blunt. And you know, and people kept relying on the community, and we now, you know, we have all these immigrants coming in our community and we need to seek it out. And it's like, no, you actually have to understand your positionality and not hope that your community, and by community what you mean is people of color, will explain to you how to be. So that was a very roundabout answer.
Okay, so for me, the current political climate, it's put me in a really reflective position of my own family history, I guess, because 2015, so just last year, was the 100-year anniversary of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greek genocide, which all 8 of my great-grandparents actually fled. They fled from their villages in northwest Iran, down south to the refugee camps that were facilitated by the British in Iraq. And what I hear in the news and personal narratives that I've read and heard from refugees really remind me of stories that I heard growing up about what my great-grandparents went through. So, and I mean, it's crazy to me because 100 years and the same thing's still happening now. And so it's felt personal in that way, but also not, because it's not my direct experience. But I do feel that there has been generational trauma because of it. So as a result, I've explored the idea of erasure as an engineered act, and also the shadows of trauma and the persistence of one's existence despite attempts to eradicate it. And I see what's happening with refugees and migration very much in the same way right now. Did you have anything to, yeah?
I'll give it a try. I'm really interested in this thing that you're bringing up, this generational trauma. And I think it's really interesting because before I was born, there was this systematic execution of political prisoners in Iran. And this is not something that really affected me directly. I don't really know any of my close family members who were executed in that time, but it's something that, even though it was way before I was born, and not really a direct thing, I feel very much implicated in this. And I think there's something really interesting in these cultural wounds that transcend generations. And maybe in this moment where the conflict in the Middle East is such a heated topic and everybody's talking about it, that you know, I wonder if this is going to be the time where we, you know, if we make the same mistakes again, or if we somehow figure out a way to do something about it. And I really don't know how much we can do, but for example, the other day, if anybody's following Iway on Instagram, he's been in the Middle East, and he was in Greece and Turkey for a long time. And a couple days ago, he was posting images of refugees getting deported. And I was looking through the comments that people had left on these images, and a lot of people had just commented a bunch of emojis of like crying emojis or like sad emojis. And I thought this was like a really interesting, I mean, yeah, this is genuinely the way people are interacting. I think part of it is that much of the way we're interacting now is through the internet, and we're using these symbols as a really poignant, I guess, stand-in for how we feel about issues. But I think there's something really interesting about this sort of cultural responsibility that I feel towards what's happening in the Middle East versus someone else in the West might feel like, I don't know if they feel as much implicated as I do. And I think this sense of implication is what is really driving my work in addressing the experience of immigrants in Canada, because everybody's talking about it, and there's a genuine worry that immigrants are soon to be perceived as this negative force within Canadian culture, and that's something that worries me and drives me to want to produce art as a way of trying to understand what's going on in people's experience.
Can I just some follow-ups? Yeah. Both of you deal with the Middle East in your practices regardless of the conflict. And I'm wondering, you know, when you talk about Ai Weiwei, who's, you know, who whose engagement, I would say, with the conflict in the Middle East is one of consumer capitalism and not actual politicization. And the crying emojis, which is not a political engagement with the conflict in the Middle East at all. And so I'm wondering, have you seen a kind of thumbs up to your practice, like a dilution of response, or an increased criticality in the recent year? Or have you at all?
Do you have barely. I don't really, I mean, I can't really think of a specific response off the top of my head, but I think definitely because of what's going on in the Middle East currently, people are a lot more open to my practice, and people are, somehow more aware that, yeah, there are these issues, and obviously artists are going to talk about them. But I mean, aside from Ai Weiwei's practice in general, I think I'm interested in that idea of the emoji and that way of communicating as a cultural way of engaging with issues, more so.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about the response in that way. I can say that when people have looked at my work, probably especially the series that's on the wall over there, home, because it's something that, the images are from something that happened so recently, which is the recent ISIS offensive in Iraq in 2014. It's so fresh in our minds and in our memory that they're like, oh, I can sort of, it's not that they can relate with it, but they keep seeing it, and then this is like, to them, what I've been told anyway is that it's a different perspective, a different way of looking at it, by being able to sort of compare to something else and vacillate between those two different experiences of the same land. So I guess, I mean, that's probably a pretty positive response, I think. Yeah. The emojis, I question as well.
Okay, well, thank you all for your answers, and we do have a couple minutes if there are any last questions from the audience for our panelists. Yes.
Any of the artwork on the walls, what you have been talking about, and which ones are your artwork?
Is that for me?
Oh,
Yeah, so the photographs are all Nedda's pieces, and the paintings are Nikkie, who's sitting here. Raise your hand so they can tell me. Yeah. And the carpet is Diana's work. So I'm just kind of acting as a curator in this. I'm not. My work is not.
Yeah, you're not just a curator. You're the curator.
And I have curated, Abedar is a visual artist as well, and I have curated her work. And I'm not a visual artist.
But Barbora is writing an essay for the catalog that we're going to be publishing for April 23rd. So covering this exhibition and kind of the larger themes that are going on locally.
Yeah. Any last questions? Okay, well, thank you to our panelists for their thoughtful and thought-provoking answers, and thank you for everybody for coming, and please enjoy the exhibition and the rest of our crawl.